Margaret Ellen Fox was born on February the 4th, 1960, to parents David and Mary Fox, and grew up alongside her 4 brothers in Burlington, New Jersey. She was a happy kid who was extremely close with her family, especially her siblings. She was only small but could hold her own when play fighting with her brothers, some of which were younger and some older. Margaret was described by her family as a bright kid. In 1974, Margaret was 14 years old and had been taking piano lessons. She also loved to ride horses. She was confident and talkative, caring and very determined. Which is why, when she finished 8th grade at St. Paul's School in Burlington for the summer in 1974, she decided that she would spend her summer babysitting to earn some money. She wanted to be able to buy herself clothes and also have the funds to go out on day trips with her siblings whenever she wanted. Margaret asked her parents if she could place an ad in the local newspaper, advertising her availability as a babysitter, but her parents were quite wary about her doing this. As mentioned, Margaret was determined, and though it did take a bit of persuasion, she pointed out to her parents that they were too overprotective of her. They eventually gave in, and her ad was placed in the newspaper. It wasn't long before Margaret's ad began to receive interest. She had a few calls about potential jobs, but it would be one in particular that would change the course of Margaret's life. One day, Margaret's house phone rang, and when she answered, a man who said his name was John Marshall was looking for a babysitter for his 5-year-old son. The thing about this call is that it shouldn't have been for Margaret. The man had originally called Margaret's younger cousin. However, she had turned the job down because not only was it too far away, but the man had seemed disappointed with her age. She had been just 11 years old, and the man had decided that she was too young. Margaret, however, was a little older, at 14 years old. She would be going into high school soon, and she also didn't mind travelling between jobs, and was even excited at the prospect. The man went on to say that he lived in Mount Holly. This was a 7-mile bus ride from Margaret's home on Penn Street in Burlington. The man had offered her $40 per week plus money for her bus fare. The hours would be 9:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. He went on to claim that she would get the bus to the intersection at High and Mill Street. Then either John himself or his wife would be waiting for her in a red Volkswagen, where they would then drive her to their home. He said that they would be happy to then drive her home at 2:30 p.m. if she was willing to stay the extra hour. He also made a big deal of telling her that she could bring her bathing suit because they had a pool in their backyard and a swing set, and their son loved to do both. Being a 14-year-old child, this excited Margaret even more, and she accepted the job. Her father David, however, had a very uneasy feeling, but he wasn't about to tell Margaret that she couldn't go. She was, after all, spending her time productively and earning money for herself. Margaret was hired on Wednesday the 19th of June 1974 and was due to begin work on Friday the 21st, just 2 days later. However, the day after the phone call, on the 20th of June, John Marshall called Margaret's home once again to postpone her start date to the following Monday after an alleged death in the family. Margaret's father David actually got to speak with John this time for himself, as did Margaret's mother. David just wanted to get a sense of the person that John Marshall was. During the conversation, there were no red flags, but David still wasn't comfortable with the situation. Margaret always told him that he guarded her and her siblings too closely and protected them too much, so I'm sure he had this in mind and didn't want to seem overbearing. And so, Monday the 24th of June soon rolled around, and Margaret was up bright and early. Her 11-year-old brother, Joe Fox, walked her to the bus stop that morning. Margaret had been wearing maroon jeans with a yellow patch above her knee, brown sandals, a blue floral top, and a checkered jacket. She was also carrying an eyeglasses case with a Huckleberry Hound design on it. Joe's last memory of his sister is watching her disappear into the crowded bus that would take her from Burlington to Mount Holly. Margaret's parents had given her specific instructions that day to call them as soon as she arrived in Mount Holly. Sadly, that call would never come. After waiting for what should have been enough time for Margaret to arrive at John Marshall's home, her parents began to worry, and so they decided to call a phone number that John Marshall had given to them in case they ever needed to contact Margaret while she was working. When her parents phoned the number, however, it rang and rang unanswered, until eventually someone picked up. It was then that David and Mary Fox knew that something was seriously wrong. The number that had been given to them was actually a payphone outside of a grocery store and was picked up by a passerby in Lumberton, 10 miles away from Margaret's home and 2 miles south of Mount Holly, where Margaret should have been. When Margaret didn't come home by 2:30 as planned, her father David reached out to a friend who worked at the East Hampton police station, and together the pair drove down to Mount Holly to search for Margaret. When no trace of her could be found, the police conducted large searches of the area, but sadly, Margaret could not be located. A few witnesses were located and said that they had seen her around the corner of Mill Street, where she was supposed to be picked up by John Marshall or his wife, but there were no sightings of her past this point. At least now, they knew that she did in fact arrive at her intended point, but what happened after this remained a mystery. Margaret's family were distraught. The possibility of Margaret having run away was dismissed quite early. She had no reason to run away. She was happy, loved her family, got on well with her siblings, and had no money, hence why she wanted to work. She also didn't know people outside of her small town, and so the police started to look into the possibility that Margaret had been abducted. The Fox family's house phone was wired so that all phone calls in and out were monitored. Unfortunately, just 4 days later, their beliefs were confirmed to be true, when they received a phone call from a man who had just one short sentence.
$10,000 might be a lot of bread, but your daughter's life is the buttered topping.
Who is it?
This call would not be released to the public, however, for 45 years after Margaret's disappearance. Investigators have said that this was only due to recent advancements in technology that were able to advance the audio. I still personally believe that should the audio have been released at the time of Margaret's disappearance, it may have made huge breakthroughs in the case. The voice is very distinctive, and even though there is much speculation that the man was trying to disguise his accent and mask his true identity, I believe the voice alone could have led to him being identified. I can't say whether he was trying to change his accent, because I detect hints of a New Jersey accent, especially the way he says daughters and the way he drops the T. It does sound rehearsed and almost robotic, as though he's reading from a sheet. He sounds like an older man, perhaps in his mid to late 40s. So 45 years on, he'd either be a very old man now or likely dead, and the possibility of someone around at that time now being able to identify him nearly 5 decades later seems very unlikely. The family immediately went underway to try and collect $10,000 to get their daughter back home, which is the equivalent of just over $52,000 in 2019. But a few days later, they received a letter stating that the deal had now been cancelled. I have a theory about this that I will talk about towards the end of the video. Detective Leonard Burr was originally assigned to the case, and the first thing he did, which proved to be quite an effective strategy, was to ride the same bus on the same route as what Margaret had rode the day she vanished. He had hoped that there would be daily commuters on there that would be able to recognise Margaret, and it didn't take long before a few were able to identify her. The first lady that came forward and said she had seen Margaret on the bus that day was a lady who said her young son had grabbed a piece of Margaret's hair when she sat in front of them. She had apologised and Margaret had turned round and struck up a conversation, which sounds exactly like her character. She could talk to anyone as if she knew them. The lady also commented that Margaret had smiley eyes, like someone who was happy. The second witness that saw Margaret after she stepped off the bus said she had approached a young man in a red sports car. Police later tracked this man down and interviewed him, but they were convinced this was not the man that had taken Margaret. He was later cleared as a suspect. Detective Burr was certain that more people had seen Margaret that day, but he felt as though people just didn't want to be bothered with the case, which is awful when you consider that this is a little girl whose family were desperate to have her home, and they didn't want to offer up potentially crucial accounts. Sadly, there were no good leads that followed, and Margaret's case began to grow cold. The police did the next best thing they could and investigated every single John Marshall within the vicinity, and surprisingly, there were quite a few. The police were able to rule them out one by one, but it would be one John Marshall in particular that stood out to them. This was a suspect who happened to work at the A&P grocery store in the same shopping centre where the alleged abductor had used the payphone. People thought that this was too much of a coincidence, but others believed that it may have been a possible setup. After all, why would he use his real name? This John Marshall was interviewed many times and was even given a polygraph test, which he managed to pass. He was also able to provide an alibi that he was working at the time that Margaret disappeared, and there was nothing substantial to subdue a case against him. Later on, there were apparent sightings of Margaret as far as the West Coast, but these leads never went anywhere, and I believe it was a case of mistaken identity. Many parents from neighbouring towns called police to report strange phone calls that their own children had received, but still, no leads for Margaret's case. 2 months later, in August, Margaret's case began to fade, and the reality that Margaret may never be found was fast becoming a possibility. There was never a day in the rest of David Fox's life that he didn't spend searching for his daughter. He plastered images of Margaret in a collage on his car windows, asked questions to everyone he met, and handed out flyers at every opportunity. He said, "I have a feeling in my search that she will break out, and I will be there at the right time and place." Joe Fox, Margaret's brother, said that Margaret's disappearance broke his parents, and they were never the same people after the day that she left home. In May of 1976, it was thought that there was a possible break in the case when a 53-year-old man called Charles Clobridge confessed to the abduction and murder of Margaret Ellen Fox. He went on to say that he dumped her body in the Catskill Mountains, but after a search, no trace of her was found. It was later discovered that Charles had actually been in hospital the day of the abduction, and he was charged with giving a false testimony. He was still investigated, but no links could be found to Margaret, and his confession was written off as a cruel prank. Detective Burr retired in 1988, but Margaret's case stayed with him, and he remarked he was disappointed he never got to bring closure to her family. Burlington Police Captain John Fine said that there was just no information sharing between police agencies at the time, and the only way to get details was if you knew somebody in another force or if you begged for it. In December of 1988, a human skull was found on the hills in the Atlantic Highlands, and a search with cadaver dogs located remains buried on the nearby beach. Buried in less than 2 feet of ground with 2 tyres placed over the top and covered with dirt. There was partial clothing found, including a platform sandal which was manufactured in the early to mid-1970s. The victim was believed to be between the ages of 15 and 19 years old and around 5'1". It was originally thought to be Margaret, but when investigators went to compare Margaret's dental records with the skull found, it was discovered that Margaret's dental records had actually been lost. The remains were later ruled out by using formidable DNA from her brother. The remains of 19 more Jane Does were compared, but none belonged to Margaret. Captain Fine wanted to have someone re-examine Margaret's case, but he said that he couldn't. The detectives were already overwhelmed by up to 100 cases each, and he couldn't put more stress on them, especially not for one that had been cold for decades and that hadn't been analysed or organised in 10 to 15 years. In 1993, David Fox passed away, sadly never having known what happened to his daughter. In 2003, Mary Fox, Margaret's mother, also passed away, and her obituary listed Margaret as one of her surviving children. In April of 2017, Captain Fine's interest in having Margaret's case re-examined was fulfilled, after retired police detective Michael D'Alessio partnered with the Burlington Police to contribute his time and expertise on a volunteer basis to review old cases. He exclaimed that he was merely re-examining the data to see if any clues jumped out to him that may have been missed in the original investigation, but he kept his expectations within reason. Unfortunately, little was discovered in the reanalysis, although it did drum up media attention to the case. In 2019 is when the audio of the phone call was released. It was apparently of very poor quality and was only able to be heard after a great level of enhancement that allowed it to be understood. To this day, Margaret's family and friends still love and miss her, and continue to wonder what became of her that fateful summer's day in 1974. There is a $25,000 reward up for information leading to the arrest of Margaret's abductor. My theory about the abductor is that I feel he was a family man. I don't know if it was true that he had a 5-year-old son, but I do feel he had some sort of family, and this was the reason he had to cancel plans on 2 separate occasions. If you recall, Margaret was supposed to begin work on Friday the 21st of June 1974, but he called a day later and postponed this meeting. I don't feel that this was John Marshall's decision. I believe it was due to circumstances out of his control. Perhaps he had a family and their plans changed to mean that they would be at home that day. For example, if he had a wife, perhaps she cancelled work that Friday, and so John obviously couldn't go ahead with his plan and had to work around someone else's plans. Secondly, when the supposed abductor phoned with a ransom of $10,000 in return for Margaret, only for him to send a letter to the family cancelling the deal after just a few days. This once again ties into the family theory. Maybe if he was holding Margaret, it was getting too risky with his family around, and he panicked and had to get rid of her. I do feel he felt as though he was getting too risky, especially since he chose to write a letter the second time in contact, rather than speak verbally with Margaret's family. Maybe he realised that someone would recognise his voice if the calls were released. At the time of her disappearance, Margaret was 5 foot 2 inches tall and weighed 105 pounds. She was a Caucasian female with brown hair and blue eyes. Margaret had 2 front right teeth missing at the time of her abduction and had freckles. She was known to wear glasses with hexagonal-shaped lenses, gold wire frames, and had a broken-off temple as well as nose pieces. As of today, in May of 2022, Margaret would be 62 years old. On the screen now is an age progression photograph of what she may look like.